The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 12th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme...
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin. President Zelensky.
We'll analyse Joe Biden's performance on the closing day of the Nato summit in Washington. We'll cross to Nairobi to look at the political situation there as the president dismisses most of the cabinet. We'll have a shot of business news and then we'll focus on India, covering Modi's visit to Moscow and what's being billed as the wedding of the century. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. The NATO summit wrapped up in Washington, D.C. yesterday. Well, our Chris Chermak is there and joins me on the line now. Chris, Andrew Muller yesterday was moaning about the extreme heat in Washington. Is that still the case?
Well, actually, today is the first day since I've been here where it might be that the extreme heat is subsiding. It's raining outside at the moment, and that's going to cool everything off a bit. But yeah, it's been absolutely excruciating, if I'm honest, especially because, you know, particularly as a journalist where you don't get to ride around in a motorcade, there's been a lot of walking with all the roadblocks and everything. So getting from one side of the convention center to the other, I mean, yeah, it's excruciating, but you find a way through.
Of course, particular heat on Joe Biden. His press conference was much anticipated. People really just waiting to pounce on him for making a mistake. And sadly, he didn't disappoint.
Well, I mean, what's incredible, frankly, is the clip that you played at the top as well, and the one that is in focus was not from the press conference itself, of course. It was a couple of hours before the press conference when he was giving a set speech about the Ukraine compact in front of a whole bunch of world leaders, where he then wanted to introduce President Zelensky and said President Putin. So that in itself, I mean, that moment was just, you know, one of sort of audible gasps in the audience. And that just, you know, heightened it even more. Then you had 2 hours waiting for the press conference, even delayed it about an hour. You were wondering what might be happening in the background. And then came the press conference. First question of the press conference, he confused Kamala Harris with President Trump, said Vice President Trump. These things, I mean, the thing to say about it is, and it's interesting looking at the media reaction now of the, you know, I've been reading a bit this morning, a lot tend to still focus on, well, he had his sort of grasp of foreign policy, and that is true. He gave an hour-long press conference, it has to be said. He spoke in a good amount of substance and detail about China. He went into a lot of detail, obviously, about Ukraine as well. So there is still a lot that he is capable of saying, but when you start with things like that, even if those are the kind of things he might have done a year ago, given the microscope that this press conference was under, it just was an incredibly difficult thing to recover from. And you did see 3 more congressmen after the press conference call on him to resign or step away from the candidacy, at least for the presidency. And, you know, we'll see whether that continues today.
Of course, this was NATO's big anniversary, its 75th. Did the whole spectacle of Biden distract from that?
It absolutely did, certainly behind the scenes. Of course, if you listen to the set pieces and the debates and the panels and things like that, even when you did interviews, governments and ministers and prime ministers, they were on their best behavior, but they would, of course, be asked about this regularly. And so they were forced into some extent defending Joe Biden. Even Keir Starmer, the UK prime minister, first time on the world stage, had to talk about Biden being in good form, as he said. So those kinds of questions. Olaf Scholz had to say the same thing for Germany. So it was just a general distraction. It was the thing that everybody was talking about behind the scenes. And there was, of course, the broader question that goes into this, which is what NATO's summit was about, how to future-proof, as they were calling it ahead of time, the NATO alliance from a possible Donald Trump presidency in the second term. That's really what, in part, this was about, strengthening the NATO alliance. So there was always going to be a backdrop of the US presidential elections. And for that matter, I should say, lots of other political distractions ahead of this. Emmanuel Macron having to defend himself and assure the world that, France would remain strong on the world stage and keep up its international commitments and on Ukraine. Viktor Orban of Hungary heading to China and Russia before the meeting, and then meeting with Donald Trump afterwards in Florida. So you had a lot of political distractions that did certainly take away from the fact that many analysts will say NATO at 75 is stronger militarily than ever before, just not so much politically.
And of course, you've been speaking with analysts and government officials at the summit all week. Can you tell us a little bit more before we hear from one of them?
Yeah, so I've been speaking, trying to gauge. We've also been speaking to ministers, of course, but analysts who you speak to on the ground here really have had a sort of mixed bag when they look at how this summit has gone. They focused on some of the wording, the fact that NATO and Stoltenberg, particularly Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General, talked about the strength of the alliance, but also a turning point, that it is essentially at war with Russia at this point, talking about a lot of the new commitments, a command in Germany. The US will be stationing cruise missiles in Germany. So there were positives there. But of course, Ukraine also not getting an invite for membership. That was something that many focused on, that basically NATO could do a whole lot more if it wanted to help Ukraine on the ground, if it really wanted to commit also to more defense spending, something that was a huge topic here as well. So that's the kind of things analysts definitely focused on, the need to spend even more on defense than many leaders are recognizing. And one analyst that I did speak to is Mikhail Baranovsky. He's the managing director of GMF East. That's sort of the German Marshall Fund's Eastern European operations. He's normally based in Warsaw, and he was sort of host MC of the NATO Public Summit, which is a gathering of think tanks and advocates and academics who meet with NATO officials to discuss what should be done at the summit and with NATO going forward. And I began by asking him just how much of a distraction Joe Biden and his health had been to this entire summit.
Well, it's true that President Biden's health, his performance in the debate, and his decision whether to potentially pull out is very much something discussed in the corridors of NATO public forum here. But I know that from other colleagues that it's also on the sidelines of the NATO summit. In many ways, the NATO summit is happening a bit on the sidelines of the main topic being US presidential election. And so it happens that the timing perfectly coincides with the big push coming from a number of Democrats asking President Biden to reconsider his run. And that's something that I frankly have seen with my very eyes visiting Congress, and all of a sudden having all the Democratic Congress people, congressmen and women, having to walk off to a secret, quote-unquote, meeting about the future of the Democratic Party.
It is quite extraordinary also in the sense that before all of this happened, the key topic at this summit, also in a way to bring it to NATO, would have been Donald Trump and what that means for NATO. And yet it does feel almost like that has been relegated somewhat to the sidelines.
You are so right. It's striking, actually. Because before coming here, I assumed, a few weeks, that we'll be talking about the upcoming Republican convention next week, President Trump, former President Trump, and his candidacy. No one is talking about it. it's striking. No one is talking about Trump. It's all about, in extension, it is about Trump, but it's focused very much on won't he about President Biden and the impact it has already on the alliance and U.S. position.
Well, we will get to a little bit of that, but tell me, first of all, also about the NATO Public Forum. This is what you have been running this week. I guess, why does it matter to the think tank world? Tell me about the history of it. Is it more about being kind of public-facing, as it is in the name, or is it really about kind of the chance to let NATO know what you think they should do?
It's very much public-facing. This is both a conversation among think tankers, experts, with the decision makers, with leaders of industry, but shared very widely with publics across of our member states. You know, NATO brings together almost 1 billion people. And there is a lot of engagement. I was talking with someone from the so-called NATO Public Diplomacy Division, so the part of NATO that deals with the outreach. And I hear that already there is over 10 million engagements with the messages coming from the NATO summit. And by the end of it, it will be more than 30 million. So that's actually very large scale of engagement through the public forum, through influencers, through journalists who are present here. And it has a key task of maintaining the public knowledge and public support for the important job of NATO, which is keeping us safe and allowing us to just have, frankly, normal lives. That was very much the message of Secretary Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State, who says, look, this is simple in the end. We are not, as NATO, in a business of fighting anyone. We are in the business of just having normal life, secure life. And that's what this forum in the end is showing.
And what is your sense then of the public perception of NATO at this point, given that, to bring it slightly back to Donald Trump, he has challenged NATO to some degree in this presidential election. So being here in the US especially, do you get the sense that NATO is something that the public perhaps takes for granted, needs to be reminded of?
You know, so it's really good question about support for NATO across the alliance, answered with a resounding yes. Yes, there is need for NATO. Yes, public support NATO. And one of the data points that I've now heard from a number of conversations is a public opinion poll done by, I believe, Reagan Institute just a week or two ago that shows that large majorities, not only of American public, but even of Republicans, want to continue, support NATO, want Ukraine to prevail in its brutal war against Russia. So public opinion is actually in a much better place than what we see from potential future leaders in their campaign. It translates also in some concerns about what the US would do under Donald Trump as president when it comes to its place within the alliance.
That was Mikhail Baranowski from the German Marshall Fund in conversation with Monocle's Chris Chermak. Now, here's Paige Reynolds with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Ukraine has urged NATO allies to lift restrictions on its use of long-range weapons against targets in Russia. Kyiv has argued that such a move would be a game-changer in its war with Moscow. Meanwhile, the United States has announced a new security package for Ukraine worth $225 million. Australia has arrested a Russian-born married couple on suspicion of spying. It's claimed that the woman, who was an information systems technician in the Australian Army, sought to access defence material and pass it on to the Russians. Police say the couple, who hold Australian citizenship, tried to access material related to Australia's national security. And one miner has died and another has been trapped underground after a pit in southern Poland was struck by an earthquake. The owner of the mine, PGG, said more than 5 miners had been brought to the surface after the tremor, which happened around 1,200 metres below ground. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Paige. It's time now for a roundup of business news with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, good afternoon to you. China has chalked up a record monthly trade surplus. What's behind that jump?
Hello, Georgina. Yes, $99 billion, the biggest trade surplus for any month in history for the Chinese economy. Now, exports have been booming. China's factories are churning out the goods. $310 billion they sold abroad. But imports dropped to just shy of $210 billion. The issue or the imbalance is that China's factories are going great guns, but China's consumers are not out there spending. There's a lack of confidence amongst the Chinese consumers, particularly given the housing market, that bleak picture in the housing market, which has been going on for years in China. So that's seeing consumer spending muted. But on the export side, on the factory side, there is plenty going on. So yes, leaving a gap of $100 billion between exports and imports. Now, that's good news in many ways for the Chinese economy. President Xi keen to get to that 5% growth target over the course of the year. Pretty touch and go whether they'll get there, and the Chinese consumer certainly not helping on that front. But it is a problem for the people on the receiving end of these exports. And we know that already there are a lot of trade tensions between China and the US, the EU, and indeed many other countries. We've seen a whole host of tariffs imposed on Chinese goods over the last year or so, particularly electric vehicles, the most high-profile example, but actually on loads of other goods as well. So, yeah, a massive trade surplus for China.
And Ewan, why is Taylor Swift, the singer, being discussed at the Bank of England?
Well, you may have read, Georgina, in the press about the Taylor Swift effect. It's been widely covered, her effect on the economy as millions of people head to these concerts, buying expensive tickets, staying in hotels and buying fancy outfits, etc. Well, the Bank of England will be making the next rate decision on August the 1st, and forecasters are warning that the Taylor Swift effect, 10 concerts in the UK during the month of June, could be having an effect on services inflation. Now, inflation in the UK is now back down exactly to target. It's 2%, the overall inflation rate in the UK, something that Rishi Sunak trumpeted during the election campaign before he was given the boot. But services inflation, that's inflation measuring everything from hotels, restaurants, travel, medical services, education, all sorts of things. It's the biggest part of the economy. Services inflation is still running at 5.7%. So prices are still almost 6% up on where they were a year ago. And this is something that the Bank of England keeps its eye on very closely, because services inflation can become entrenched. It's domestically generated, and it's something that the Bank of England is not happy with. Now, you get the feeling they might have liked to cut rates at the last meeting back in June, but we did have that election campaign on, so I think politically it would have been difficult to do that. So people in the markets reckon there's probably a 50-50 chance of a rate cut on the 1st of August, but they are going to have to worry about Taylor Swift.
Extraordinary. Ewan, thank you very much indeed. That was Bloomberg's Ewan Potts, and you're listening to The Briefing. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. 2 years ago, William Ruto was elected as the president of Kenya. His main campaign promise was to emancipate the poor. But this hasn't gone to plan, and following nationwide demonstrations against a tax hike which turned deadly, he's now dismissed almost his entire cabinet. To track how this happened and what's next for the East African nation, we're joined down the line by Nairobi-based journalist Navina Couture. Navina, welcome back to the show. I wonder if you could take us back to the election of Ruto in September 2022. So he'd previously served as the Deputy President, the Minister for Home Affairs, Minister for Agriculture, Minister for Higher Education. He had a lot of experience in government. How did it all go so badly wrong?
I think it started going very badly wrong with cuts to public services, but also tax hikes that Mr. Ruto actually had to bring in to bring down public debt. The country is heavily indebted. Some of these loans were due for repayment this year and last year, and that put him under a lot of pressure to find savings and to increase the tax base in the country. That has resulted with hikes in the price for petrol, hikes in the price for food, and overall the rising cost of living has led a lot of young Kenyans on to the streets. We've seen that over the last couple of weeks. That has really increased the pressure on President Ruto. And what we've seen yesterday is that he's prepared to basically, he was prepared to basically sack the cabinet. And what he is saying start from scratch after a massive public dialogue that he has announced.
Right. So tell us more about this dialogue, on which members of the cabinet have kept their jobs and why that's significant.
I mean, at the moment, only the foreign minister is still in place. The remaining cabinet has been sacked. It is not possible to sack the vice president, Mr. Gachagua. He's also a political ally. He was the one who helped Ruto win this election by rallying supporters in central Kenya. The announcement is there's going to be a broad public dialogue. I think we will have to see what that actually means in detail to come up with a cabinet that will address issues that the protesters have been calling for, like corruption and graft in the government.
Right. So what happens in the interim? Because it's just then Ruto, his vice, and the foreign minister in charge.
Exactly. In the meantime, he says the senior public servants will run the country. I don't think he can do that for very long. I think it is important to understand, though, that this is a presidential system. President Ruto is very powerful. So in a way, it depends on who he will appoint next to gauge as to whether there'll be actual change or whether they are prepared to address issues like corruption within the system. I think this cabinet was very loyal to Ruto. They basically executed the way they were told. And a lot of observers are saying it now really depends on the personalities he's prepared to put in the cabinet.
I mean, young Kenyans are very angry, particularly after those peaceful demonstrations turned absolutely deadly. Is this enough? Can Ruto hang on to power after everything that's happened over the last few weeks?
I have to say, I think it's important to acknowledge the changes he has been prepared to make. He has dropped this finance bill that basically stirred these protests. He has also dissolved offices that I think observers 6 months ago would have said he will never touch, like the office in the budget for his wife, the office in the budget for wives of the vice president and the prime minister. But I think the protesters want to see more substantial change. They want to see the graft arrest at higher levels. They're saying that there's no need to increase taxes at the bottom when people at the top are basically siphoning money off and taking it abroad. And I think it will really depend on the measures he's prepared to implement in order for the protesters to calm down.
Navina, thank you very much indeed. That's Navina Couture there, speaking to us from Nairobi. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. As NATO was meeting in Washington, India's Prime Minister was in Moscow, cozying up to Vladimir Putin. Well, joining me to discuss this is Maya Sharma, who's a journalist based in Bangalore. But today, big treat for me. We've never come face to face before. She's here in our London studios. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's really a thrill.
It's really great to be able to look at you in the eye and actually sort of have a conversation that isn't interrupted by all sorts of screens and microphones.
Absolutely.
So welcome in real life,
Thank
Maya.
you.
What were the main takeaways from this meeting between the two leaders?
Well, of course, in terms of India, Russia, there was talk about trade. It's right now at a massive 65 billion. They're trying to get it up to 100 billion. And it's right now skewed in favour of Russia. And India is trying to get it a little bit more balanced. Nuclear deals were on the cards. Russia's trying to help India with nuclear energy. That would be the main thing, the business, the nuclear energy. And also, Prime Minister Modi did raise the issue of some Indians being maybe tricked into fighting in active service against Ukraine. 4 Indians have died so far fighting Ukraine with the Russian army. They thought they were doing non-combatant work, but they were actually killed. So he's raised that issue, and the attempt is to get those Indians back home.
Now, you mentioned nuclear, and I wonder how that played with the US and NATO.
Not happy at all. They were not happy at all with India's closeness to Russia, which of course has continued since the Cold War days. It's a there's a long history there. US was not happy with that at all. But basically, I think the US was very unhappy, as was Zelensky as well, about the very fact that Modi was there, not just there, but that great big bear hug, great big hug did not go down well. Zelensky saying it was a very sad day, very disappointing that the world's largest democracy was doing this. And the timing along with the NATO conference, it did not make the US and the allies very happy with what was going on. It was a message from Modi that we are close to Russia. We continue to be close to Russia. And India's never directly condemned the attack on Ukraine. It has said it's an era of peace. Even in Russia, Modi did say it's very sad to see innocent children killed. But it's not been an outright condemnation. And they've always abstained from any UN resolution actually condemning the attack. So, yeah, US not greatly happy with what went on.
What about China? Because, of course, India and China are at loggerheads, but China and Russia are close.
Yes, that could be very well one of the reasons why Prime Minister Modi actually went there. Because there is this growing closeness between Russia and China. They're getting very cozy. And India has this rivalry with China, not happy with what's happening on the border between the two countries. So by going to Russia, Modi is kind of reasserting, we're here. Don't get too close to China. Which is also something that America may not be happy with. They do want India to progress as a balance to China. But India may be trying to tell Russia we're here also.
What's the reaction been back in India, the domestic reaction to all of this? Do people care?
They care in the sense that people are sad that there are Indians going there fighting in a war that they have nothing to do with and dying. That is a problem. But of course, Prime Minister Modi has come back to power in the recent election, not with the massive majority expected. But essentially the India-Russia equation has so long that Russia is considered a friend of the country.
Now, you're in London today, so I guess you're not invited to India's wedding of the century.
I checked my mail, Georgina. I just couldn't find that invited. I'm just really disappointed.
Listen, tell us about Anant Ambani. He's the son of Asia's richest man. After months of celebration, he's to be married today.
You know, when the pre-wedding celebration started months ago, many of us thought that was the wedding. We had Bollywood stars, we had international stars, and we had millions of dollars spent on that wedding. So we thought that was it. It was the pre-wedding, which continued. There was parties on yachts around Europe. Now we are told that this weekend in Mumbai is the actual wedding. And many people will be relieved to see that over, because many roads in Mumbai have actually been shut. The city's flooded, but traffic is being disrupted. But it's being considered a public event because so many VIPs from abroad are coming. Many big pop stars, film stars are there. There are rumours of Adele appearing for this last section, but of course that's not confirmed yet.
I wonder what the reaction is to displays of conspicuous consumption like this.
It is disturbing. Those in favour of it say it's boosting the whole wedding industry because he's spending a lot of money and a lot of people are getting paid. But especially in a country like India, where the disparity is so huge between the super rich and the super poor, it's conspicuous consumption which many have criticised as tasteless.
I mean, he did put on a wedding for, I think, 50 underprivileged couples.
There were those couples which he did pay for the wedding, and wedding expenditure is, unfortunately, a very huge consideration for especially the fathers of daughters. But overall, there has been a lot of criticism about this entire thing. I mean, it may have been very profitable for Rihanna and Justin Bieber and Katy Perry and others, but for the average Indian watching this, and it also may give a message to have fancier weddings, which have actually financially crippled many families with girls to get married.
Yeah. Here in Britain, there's a lot of talk about the fact that England will be playing in the Euros. And of course, many people had booked their weddings in advance and it clashes with the football. So a lot of unhappy brides.
Who would have thought that, England would get this far? If
Maya, have a lovely weekend in London. I'm sorry you're not at the wedding. Actually, I don't think you're sorry at all, are you?
I would have loved to watch it, but I may not have told the world that I was there.
Maya Sharma, thank you very much indeed. And finally on today's show, film directors Aran Botarai, who's from Bhutan, and Dorothea Zerbo, who hails from Hungary, met while studying for master's degrees in documentary filmmaking in Europe. Agent of Happiness, their second co-directed documentary, follows a Bhutanese civil servant named Amber, who travels around the country surveying residents for Bhutan's gross national happiness index, whilst wrestling with his own search for happiness. The film premiered at Sundance and will be released in the UK today. Monocle's Naomi Tsu Elegant spoke to the directors to hear more. First, Aaron explains his own relationship to the gross national happiness index.
I grew up studying gross national happiness in my classroom I was celebrating National Happiness Day. I was listening to the King's speeches about gross national happiness. At that time, I really didn't understand what gross national happiness meant. Only when we actually started traveling with our previous film to festivals, we realized that everybody associates Bhutan with this very happy nation, so happy kingdom. So we were like, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and give a different perspective to gross national happiness.
Yes, and the more practical reason why we started to tackle this subject is also that when we were shooting our previous film, The Next Guardian, one day Amber and his colleague stepped in the house of our previous character and they did the happiness survey with them. And actually for me, that was the first moment when I witnessed how they execute or how they conduct the happiness survey. And it was a very inspiring situation because they were conducting a very engaging conversation, but at the same time, the two agents, they were calculating and transforming into numbers, very subjective life events and emotions and wishes and dreams. And actually, I think that was the moment that inspired us very much, that we would like to do something with the happiness survey that the government conducts every 5 years. And we thought that what the agents do themselves, it's almost like what also documentary filmmakers do, getting to know people and honestly and curiously listening to them. So we thought that if we follow the two agents, they could be even our extensions in the film. And we knew from the very beginning that we would like to use gross national happiness and the happiness survey more as an excuse to step into the intimate and personal lives of people and not make a film about gross national happiness, because many study and television reportage was made about this subject. But as Arun said, just to look behind what are the real feelings and desires of people in the country.
It struck me as well when I was watching that you had an interviewer on camera who was himself one of the subjects of the film. What was the process like of filming someone who's kind of doing your job in a way?
It was great because actually the first time we met Amber, we also got very close to him because he was such a great listener and he genuinely wanted to hear people's stories beyond stats in the survey itself. So that's one of the reasons we thought that, okay, he's such a great person to have in the film. And then, of course, later when we realized that he himself is not so happy and he's actually in search for love, we thought that there is a happiness agent who is in search of his own happiness. So we thought that there's such a great premise for the film.
Yes, and we also felt that the happiness survey method itself, it's almost like a casting for the film. Because all the people with whom we met, they were spontaneous encounters, and we were going from door to door, and through the questionnaire, we were getting to know them. Almost the method of casting became the film itself, the narrative itself.
That was the directing team behind the new film Agent of Happiness, which is available to watch in UK cinemas today. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Paige Reynolds, our researcher was Sana Jimani, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye and thanks for listening.